Masechet Baba Mesia Daf Sadi Aleph Itmar Chasama Bekol V'Niga Bekol. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayav Resh Lakish Amar Patur. If someone muzzles an ox, but not physically, only with his voice. In other words, the animal is not muzzled at all, but every time it goes and tries to eat something, the owner says, calls its attention away and says, "Hey, no, don't do that, don't eat that." So effectively, he's stopping it from eating, but not with any physical action, only with the voice. Or you have two animals of different species that are yoked together, which it's itself not punishable, but only if you lead it. So he doesn't lead it physically by pulling them or pushing them, but rather only calling to them with his voice and making them move. So is that considered violating working animals of different species yoked together? It's a machloket. Rabbi Yochanan says, yes, he is liable, because after all, he is doing it. Resh Lakish says, no. We have a general rule that any time one violates a lav, but there's no action, if you don't do it by doing an action, then it's not punishable with lashes. So that would be Resh Lakish's reason to say patur. But Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayav Akimat Piv Havya Maaseh. Resh Lakish Amar Patur Kala Lahave Maaseh. Rabbi Yochanan says, moving his lips, twisting his mouth by talking, that's an action. It's a small action, but still that's an action. But Resh Lakish says, no, he is not liable because speaking is not considered an action. Itibe Rabbi Yochanan Resh Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan is going to challenge Resh Lakish's statement that speaking is not an action, because here we have a case of speaking where it is an action. This is talking about trying to exchange one animal for another. The Mishnah in Masechet Timurah says, it lists the people that are liable if you have one consecrated animal. And the owner says, you know what, I want that other animal to be a replacement for it. So if he says it's just with words, you just say that, then number one, he violates a prohibition of trying to substitute one animal for another, timurah. And in addition, both animals become consecrated, and so it is effective, in other words, in making the second animal consecrated, but is not effective in making the first animal unconsecrated. So both animals are consecrated, and he violates the prohibition. Now the Mishnah explains, Lo she'adam rashai lehamir, when it says that anyone who does this, man or woman, if they do a substitution, it's effective. That doesn't mean it's permitted. Ela shimhemir mumar v'sofeget harba'im. Rather, when we say it's effective, it means that both animals become consecrated, and the person that does it is liable to get lashes. So what we see here is that someone violates a lav, just with words, even without doing anything, without moving the animals or anything, one is liable to get lashes, even though it's only with words. Rabbi Yochanan says, see, I'm right. Moving one's lips is considered an action, and so here too, the same thing. You can violate muzzling an animal just with talking. Amar Lakish answers, oh, listen, that Mishnah is only the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. He's a minority opinion that says that in Isur Lav, even though it has no action, still you get lashes. That's that Mishnah. But I follow the other opinions, the rabbis that say that if it's a Lav Shen Bo Maaseh and Lokin Alav. So you have no challenge to me from that Mishnah. But then we ask a question, and we masit mukmet la Rabbi Yehuda, va'katani resha hakom emirin echad anashim v'echad anashim, v'avinan ba'kol atuye mai la'atuye yoresh udela Rabbi Yehuda. Can you really say that Mishnah is only the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda? Look at the beginning of the Mishnah. It says anyone can effectuate a substitution, whether men or women. Can means it is effectuated. It's prohibited to do so, but it works. And when we analyzed that, we said hakol. What is that word coming to include? And we said it's coming to include an heir. If someone had an animal that he consecrated, and then he died, and then his son inherited that consecrated animal, then the son also, if he tries to substitute it for another, then it is effective, and he violates the law, and both animals are holy. And now this is not the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda says that an heir, since he's not the one that made it consecrated in the first place, if he says, I want to exchange this animal for another, nothing happens. The second animal is not consecrated, and he does not violate any prohibition. Also, an heir does not do semicha. When he offers the animal, he doesn't put his hands on the head of the animal. So we see that this Mishnah cannot be Rabbi Yehuda, because the beginning of the Mishnah is not Rabbi Yehuda. So you cannot say that this next part of the Mishnah is only Rabbi Yehuda. That's the challenge. But we can answer. Shakish can explain that the Tana of our Mishnah is not himself Rabbi Yehuda. When we say Rabbi Yehuda, it's not Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, it's Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai, the fourth generation Tana. And so this, the Tana of our Mishnah, whoever it is, agrees with Rabbi Yehuda in one law and disagrees in another law. So the Resha is not like Rabbi Yehuda, and the Sefa is like Rabbi Yehuda. But so Shakish still hasn't answered. The Sefa that says he gets lashes is following the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, that even though there's no Maaseh, still one gets lashes. And Shakish says, I follow the other opinion of the other rabbis that say not so. Tenor Banan. החוסם את הפרה ודש בה לוקה, ומשלם 4 קבין לפרה ו3 קבין לחמור. Someone muzzles a cow and threshes with it, he gets lashes. That's the normal lav, regular. This is not talking about just speaking, regular, actually putting a muzzle on the mouth of the animal. Now, not only does he get lashes, he also has to pay 4 kav of grain to the owner. Let's say if he's borrowing it, to the owner of the cow, or if it's a donkey, only 3 kav, because 3 that eats less. In other words, if someone's borrowing an animal, he has to feed it. That's part of the deal, right? I'm borrowing your animal. While I have it, I have to feed it. So now, because I muzzled it while it was working, not only do I violate the biblical prohibition of working it while muzzling, and for that you get lashes, but I also owe a monetary obligation to the owner because I denied it food. How much food would an animal eat in a day? If a cow typically would eat 4 kav, a donkey typically would eat 3 kav. If he rents it and uses it for 3 days, he'd have to pay 3 times this amount. Okay, that's a very important baraita. You see, it's also a civil case. But the challenge is, we know one only gets if one does one action that makes him liable to 2 punishments, then he only gets the more severe punishment. If you do one action that requires you to get lashes and death, then no, you don't. You only get death and a death penalty. And if one does an action that requires lashes and payment, then you'd only get lashes, the more severe one, and you would not have payment. How come over here, according to this baraita, one gets 2 punishments? Okay, so we're going to have a couple of answers to this. Okay, it could be that this baraita is the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir agrees that you can't get death penalty and another punishment. That's true. But here, but he disagrees regarding lokeu mishalem. He thinks it's possible, as long as one of them is not the death penalty, it is possible to get 2 punishments and to get lashes and have to pay. That's Rabbi Meir's opinion. So this is the opinion of Rabbi Meir. That's answer number 1. Rava amar etnan asra Torah afilu ba al imo. So Rava says, he's giving a comparison to a case where one is liable to, in this case, it's going to be the death penalty and payment. And his point is going to be that although the court cannot require him to pay, nevertheless, he has his own obligation to pay, right? He is liable. There are cases where the court doesn't have enough proof. So, okay, the court can't mandate you to pay, but if you really owe the money, then you have a moral and legal obligation to pay, even if the court can't make you do so. So one example where we see that is etnan zona. Etnan zona is, let's say, if someone pays a zona, a prostitute, with an animal. That's the payment. That animal cannot be used as a sacrifice. Okay, that's the law. That's law number 1. Now, what if, I know it's a taboo case, but don't worry, he's going to get the death penalty for this. If a person pays an animal to his own mother, who is a zona, to be with her, then number 1, he's going to get the death penalty for it. and the animal that he gives her is also prohibited. Now our question is, wait, if he gets the death penalty, then he should not have to pay. And it's not both. And therefore, since he doesn't have to pay, the animal that he gives should not be prohibited as an etnan zonah. Yet, Rava says that's not true, right? We see it is etnan zonah. The animal is considered a payment, even though he also gets the death penalty. So we learn from here that even though the court will only kill him and will not get, the court cannot force him to pay. In other words, if she goes to the court and says, hey, my son, he promised, he never paid me. Okay, the court is not going to make him pay because they're going to kill him. And nevertheless, if he does pay and gives an animal to her, that animal becomes prohibited to use as a sacrifice. So we learn from here that although when there's a double punishment, the court cannot impose the lesser punishment, but the person still himself is liable to pay it. And so that's what we're talking about here also. If someone muzzles an animal, although he's going to get lashes, and therefore the court will not make him pay the grain to the owner, but he is liable himself to pay. That was the second answer. Third, Rav Papa Amar, Mishat Meshicha Ichayev La B'Mizonoteha, Umilka La Lake Ad She'at Chasima. Rav Papa explains that the two punishments are incurred at different times. From the moment that the renter pulls the animal, so he becomes liable to feed it. No matter what he does with it, he has to feed the animal. And that would be a normal amount, 4 kav per day for a cow. So that becomes liable at the moment that he pulls it, even before he worked it. And then when he muzzles it and brings it onto the threshing floor to work, then he is liable to lashes. And therefore, these are two liabilities that happen at different times. We only say, Kim le b'drabamineh, when it's one action that incurs two punishments, but not if it's two different actions at two different times. Good. Okay, so that's the three answers. Now, since we mentioned a papa about one law, we're going to mention what a papa said about two other laws not related. Amar papa, hanemile ba'uminai debe rav papa bar abba ufashti lehu liisura. Chada kilcheta v'chada delav kilcheta. Rav Papa says that the following two questions were raised to me when I was in the house of a different Rav Papa bar abba. And I answered both of them, and I said prohibited. One of them was the proper halacha, and one of them I said prohibited because I was being extra stringent, although it's not the official halacha. So let's see the two cases. Be'o minai, mahu lalush et ha'isa bechalav, upashti lehu li'isura kilcheta, detanya. They asked me if you're allowed to knead dough with milk. If you want to knead dough and put milk in as one of the ingredients, they asked me, is that allowed? I told them it's not allowed. And that is the official halacha, as we learn in a Braita. One cannot mix milk into a dough. And if you do, the whole thing is prohibited to eat. Why? Because it can lead to sin. How? If someone sees bread, most bread is parv. And so someone will say, oh, here's some bread, and he's going to eat it with meat, not knowing that there's milk in it. And so therefore it's very easy to get mixed up, to mix it up, and then end up eating meat and milk. And therefore it's prohibited to even make dairy bread. This is important halacha. It applies till today. Okay, וכיוצא בו אין תשין את התנור בעלייה, ואם תש כל הפת כולה אסורה עד שיסיק את התנור. Similarly, one is not allowed to smear fat of an animal's tail onto the oven. They're going to grease the oven, because then if he bakes bread in it, it will be meat bread. And so if he does that and he bakes bread, it's all prohibited. Same reason. This is now meat bread. Now, the next person is not going to know that there's meat mixed into it. And well, remember in those days they took the dough and they stuck it to the side of the oven. So it's getting cooked directly on that meat fat. And the person will not know that this is meat bread and eat it with cheese. And then violate meat and milk. So this is prohibited until you heat the oven and basically burn off all of the meat fat, or after it's all burnt off, it's kind of koshering the oven, okay, then you can cook in it. All right, so that was one answer, and that was lehalacha. The question is, are you allowed to bring a male and female animal of different species and put them into a pen together? Now, if you mate them, that's a prohibition of kilayim. You're not allowed to do that. But he didn't physically mate them. Rather, he just brought them into a pen. He made them have yichud. Now, I don't know what they're going to do once they're in yichud. It could be on their own they will mate, but this guy didn't do it directly. So is that permitted to put them in a pen, or do you say you can't even put them in a pen together? Or that's already leading to setting them up for kilayim, and that's already too much involvement. The answer he gave was, Pashti lahuli isura dalav kilchet. I told him, don't do it. But that was not the official halacha. Really, it's allowed to do so. But in this case, these people, I had to be machmir in this particular situation because I didn't trust them to keep things right, and it might lead to other things. Okay, Damash Shemuel. Ubimena'afim ad sheyira'u kederech hamena'afim b'kilayim ad sheyachnis kemichol b'shvoferet. Now, how do we know that the official halacha is that it will be permitted to put them in a pen together? Because Shemuel says two things. The first one is regarding adulterers. If someone is a witness to adultery, well, what exactly does the witness have to see in order to testify that these two people violated adultery? It only has to see that they acted in a way of adulterers. He doesn't have to see the physical, actual act and intimacy. He just has to see that they're in a bed together, and you can tell what they're doing, and that's sufficient for him to testify, yes, they violated adultery. He doesn't have to go up and get in too close. That's regarding humans and adultery. Now, regarding kilayim, one is only liable for kilayim if he actually inserts, here they use an analogy, this is a tube that they would use for cosmetics or medicine, and so they put the medicine in here, and then they had a stick that they would dip into here and then put on their eye, and to apply the medicine. So using this as an analogy, one is only liable to kilayim if one takes the male organ of one species of animal and physically puts it into the female organ, then it's liable. But if he would do less than that, like just put the two animals into a pen together, then he is not liable. So we see that that is the official halacha. We now challenge Shemuel's lenient ruling. Mativ Rav Achtevoy bar Ameh. Ilu ne'emar behemtecha lo tarbiya, hayiti omer lo ye'echaz adam ha'behema b'sha'a she'oleh aleha zachar. Tamud omar kilayim. So we have a braita that said, first it analyzes the first three words of the pasuk. Your animal you shall not cause to mate. Now, without the word kilayim, it sounds like it's talking about animals of the same species. So if I only had those three words, I would say that a person is not allowed to hold on to the female animal, say hold on to it by its horns, to make it easier for the male to mount her. So that would not be allowed at all. But then the word kilayim, which means crossbreeding the different species, teaches me that it's only not allowed if it's different species. But if it was the same species, then that's permitted. There's nothing, it's the same species, and a guy owns these animals and he wants them to mate, so he's allowed to hold on to the females to make it easier for the male. So what do we see from there? That one is permitted to hold on to the female only if it's min b'mino, the same type of animal. But if it's kilayim, one is not allowed, not even to hold the female. In other words, this is more prohibitive than what Shemuel said. Shemuel said the only thing you cannot do with kilayim is actually put the stick into the tube. But here it says one is, of course that's not allowed. One also is not allowed to even hold the animal, even though they're acting on their own. So that's a challenge to Shemuel. So we answer, my achiza haknasa. No, when it says achiza lo yechoz, don't hold, it's not literally talking about holding the female animal, but rather it's talking about holding the male member and putting it in physically. So why are you talking about, why do you call that holding? Because holding sounds like it's holding the animal itself. We want to use nice language. We don't want to be so explicit. Right? So that's why the rabbis use analogies like this with the tube. And so That's why this baraita says lo ye'echoz, but really what it's saying is that the only thing that's not allowed is if it's kilayim, different species, and one actually inserts. Amar Rav Yehuda, min bemino mutar lachnis kemechol bishvoferet, va'afilu mishum perisuta leka, mai ta'ama be'abidete terid. Rav Yehuda adds another law and says if it's animals of the same species, a person has a bull and a cow, and he wants to mate them, he wants to have offspring in his farm, so this is totally allowed, and in that case the farmer is even permitted to take the male member and put it into the female. And we don't even have to worry about licentiousness. In general, there is a halacha that a person should not watch animals mating that are not his, because it's not proper, it's not modest. However, if it's his own animals, then he's allowed to even put it in. Why? Because he's occupied with his work. He owns these animals. He has to have a next generation. He has to breed them, and so this is his work. He's not going to lead to any negative thoughts. Mativ Rav Achdeboy bar Ameh. Now that we have a challenge from Rav Achdeboy, Ilu ne'emar behem techalot harbiya, hayiti omer lo yechoz adam et behema kedesh yale eleha zachar. Tamad lomar kilayim huda, sor hamin bemino shareh. The challenge is from the same source that we just quoted, and the source, remember, says if you only had the first three words of the pasuk, that you cannot cause your animals to mate, I would have said it's talking about animals of the same species, that one is not allowed to hold the female to allow the male to mount her. But then the pasuk says kilayim, and now we see that only kilayim is prohibited. But if it's the same species, then it's permitted to hold the female. So that means umin bemino nami achizain hachnasala. So even with regarding min bemino, same species, one is only allowed to hold the female, but one cannot actually take the male member and put it in. So that's a challenge to Rav Yehuda, who says that that is permitted. And so our answer is like we answered just now. My achiza hachnasa v'may kari le achiza lishana me'aliyah. In this baraita, when it says lo yechoz, it's not referring actually to holding the female in place by holding its horns, but rather actually inserting its member into the female. And so why is it called lo ye'echoz? Why is it used that language? Again, to use a nicer language and not have to be so explicit. Rav Asher, hamilata ba'u minai tebe Rav Nechemia resh galuta. Ma'u nachnis min umino v'she'eno mino ladir. Rav Asher says that the house of Nechemia resh galuta, the members of the house asked me the following question: is one allowed to put three animals into a pen together? Two of them are the same species and one not of the same species. All right, can you assume that, well, since there's three together, most likely those that are the same species will mate with each other, which is permitted, and they'll leave out the third wheel there. Since there's two that are the same species, they will follow each other. Or do we say, no, still not allowed? And I told them it's not allowed, even though that's not the official halacha. We just saw the official halacha is that you can even put two animals of different species in a pen together. So all the more so, three, when two of them are the same species, is permitted. But for their case, I told them it's not allowed because of slaves. See, that's why it's important that it was the Resh Galuta. He's very rich, he has many slaves, and the slaves, they are not going to be so careful about the morality of the situation. And if you tell them that's allowed to put these three animals in the pen together, then they'll end up more actively crossbreeding the animals that are of different species. And so this is an important lesson about how the rabbis would give different answers to different people depending on who they are and the situation. And sometimes even if something is technically permitted, if they saw that it would be misunderstood or misapplied, then they would give a more stringent ruling. Next Mishnah, Haya ose biyadav aval lo beraglav. Beraglav aval lo biyadav. Afilu bichtefo hare ze ochel. So now we're going back to A human worker, we said, he is allowed to eat in the vineyard while he is working, and it doesn't matter what work he's doing. If he was working just with his hands but not with his feet, or just with his feet and not with his hands, or just with his shoulder. He was, let's say, carrying things, carrying baskets on his shoulder. So in all those cases, he is allowed to eat from the field, and it doesn't matter what part of his body or only some part of his body he is working with. This is in contrast to Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ad sheyaseh beyadav uberaglav. Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Yehuda says only if he is working with his hands and his feet all at the same time. He's walking around and plucking things and moving things with his feet and so on. Then he's allowed. But if he's only just sitting and doing something with his hands, that would not be sufficient. What's the explanation for the Tanakh Kama? Because it says if you come and enter into your neighbor's vineyard. So as long as you're in your neighbor's vineyard and you're working for him, it doesn't matter what your work is, one that you're allowed to eat. That's the law. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda says you have to be working with your hands and feet. What's his source? Kishor. Already previously we compared the human to the animal. And just like you cannot muzzle an animal, you have to let it eat, so to the human you have to let it eat. And we learn the laws of one from the other. So we learn here, just like an ox, it's walking on all fours. While it's threshing or pulling, whatever it's doing, it's obviously walking on all fours. It doesn't know how to walk on two. So since it only it can eat when it is using its forelegs and hind legs, so too a human only is permitted to eat from the vineyard if he's using both his hands and his feet while he is working. Good. Ba'e Rabba bar Rav Huna. Dash bavazin v'tanagolim. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda mahu. Here's an interesting question. What if one is using geese and chickens to thresh? According to Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Yehuda, what would we say? Since it only walks on 2 feet, it doesn't have arms. Is it that it's using all of its strength, all of its possible limbs and strength that it is using, and so therefore you have to let the chickens eat from the grain while they're working, or does he mean literally? It has to be using 4 legs, 2 hands and 2 feet, and it doesn't have it, and therefore it's not possible. It doesn't have it, and therefore it cannot eat, right? Even though it's not possible for it, but still, only animals or human beings that have arms and legs and are using them all, they can eat. But chickens, since they don't have 4 arms, 4 legs, so they cannot possibly ever use all 4, and therefore they cannot eat. So we leave this question standing. Tekel. Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rabba bar Avu. פועלים עד שלא הלכו שתי וערב בגת אוכלין ענבים ואין שותין יין. מי שהלכו שתי וערב בגת אוכלין ענבים ושותין yayin. So Nachman says, name of Rabba bar Avu, when workers, if they, let's say they're stepping on grapes to turn the grapes into wine. So if they have not yet walked lengthwise and crosswise, so they just started stepping on them a little bit, then they're allowed to eat the grapes because they're working with grapes, but they cannot drink the wine because they have not yet made wine. Whereas once they walk one way, lengthwise and crosswise, so now they're already making wine. So since they're involved in making the wine, they can eat the grapes and the wine, right? There might be some wine there, a little bit of wine from before, so that but they cannot. Let's say there was wine from before. They cannot drink the wine because they didn't make any wine. So you can only eat from the material that you are working with. So the grapes are there the whole time, and they're stepping on the grapes a little bit. So they already started. They can eat from the grapes, but only once they make wine, only then can they drink wine. And next Mishnah, Haya ose bete'enim lo yochal ba'anavim, ba'anavim lo yochal ba'te'enim, ava moneh et asmo ad shemagia lemekom yafot ve'ochel. If a worker is working with figs, he cannot eat grapes. If he's working with the grapes, he cannot eat the figs. He can only work from the species that he can only eat from the species that he is working on. However, what he can do is, let's say over here he's working on figs that are not such great quality, and so he's not going to eat now. Instead, when he gets to the, down the road, when there are figs of better quality, he's going to wait and eat more of those. That's permitted because he's working on all of those figs, and so he doesn't want to fill up on the bad figs and eat more of the good figs. That's permitted because it's all the same type. וכולם לא עמדו אלא בשעת מלאכה, אבל משום השב עבדה לבעלים עמדו, פועלים אוכלים בהליכתן מאומן לאומן, ובחזירתן מן הגת, ובחמור כשהיא פורקת. Now, in all these cases, the law amru, the letter of the law, of the tradition that was stated, is only when they're actually working. In other words, if the workers are taking a break, sitting down on the side, they cannot eat from the grapes only when they're actually working. And that would, from the letter of the law, that would include travel time. Let's say they finished one row and they're traveling to another row or another field, another area owned by the same owner. So during that travel time, or they went to the wine press and they're walking back from the wine press. From the letter of the law, they would not be able to eat while they're just walking or taking a break. However, because of the principle that one should restore lost property to the owner, so the rabbi said, you know what, even though it's not the deoraita law, but we will allow the workers to eat while they are walking from one road to another or walking from the wine press. So how is that beneficial to the owner? It's beneficial because this way the workers will eat while they're walking, and they're not doing work anyway, and that way they'll be more full and satiated, and then when they're actually working, they're likely to eat less. So it actually is a good idea for the benefit of the owner to allow the workers that they'll collect while they're working on one row. They'll take some grapes, and as they're walking to the next row, so they won't eat as much while they're working on this row, because they know that, okay, we're near the end of the row, and then they'll eat while they're walking, and that way they'll actually will work better. And so that's a benefit to everyone to permit them to eat while they're walking, even though they're not actually working. Eat while they're walking, even though they're not actually working. Now, regarding a donkey, it can eat while it's being unloaded. It's carrying something, so that's also, working it. Now, while it's on its back, it's going to be hard for it to eat something that's on its back. But while it's being unloaded and there's still stuff on its back, it's still carrying that item, so it can eat from what has been unloaded. Gemara will discuss all this further. עושה בגפן זה מהו שיאכל בגפן אחר, ממין שאתה נותן לחלב של בעל הבית בעינן והאיקה, או דילמה ממה שאתה נותן לחלב של בעל הבית בעינן והלקה. Question, if, let's say the workers are working on this particular vine here, vine A, are they allowed to eat from a different vine, a vine that's behind them, vine B, that they're not actually plucking? So do we say that it's the same species of what they're working on, whatever species they're putting into the vessels of the owner? That's what we need, and it is the same species. It is still all grapes. Or do we say from the actual vine that he is picking from and putting into the vessels of the owner, only from that he can eat, and if it's a different vine that's nearby, then he cannot eat from that. Okay, then we're going to try to answer it from just a practical question. If you think that when you're working on one vine, you cannot eat from a different vine, how would the law ever apply to ox? We know the laws applying to human workers are the same as the laws applying to an ox, that it also has to be able to eat while it's working. How could you ever have a case of an ox that would be able to eat something that's attached to the ground? Because after all, if an ox is walking, usually it has the wagon behind it, or the plow, or whatever it is, behind it. And so, let's say it's pulling a wagon. So the workers are plucking grapes and putting it into the wagon while the animal's in front. But the animal, it's the same law. If you say it can only eat from the very grapes, from the very vine that is being plucked, but it's already a few feet ahead on a different vine. So that would mean that an animal would never be able to eat while it's working, because it wouldn't be the same vine. So isn't that a good proof that as long as you're plucking grapes, you can eat from any vine? And the answer is not necessarily. Amar Rav Shesha b'red Rav Idi bisracha. It could be talking about a long branch, a long vine that extends all the way from where the animal's head is and all the way back to where the wagon is, and so such that the workers are plucking from the very same vine that the animal in front will also be eating from. And so that is not a proof. Let's try another one. Tashema. Mishnah said that if the workers are laboring with the figs, they cannot eat grapes. That means if it was one set of figs and another set of figs, in a situation that would be similar to figs and grapes, then it would be permitted. In other words, it sounds like a person's working on figs, he can't eat from grapes. But if he's working on figs, he could eat from other figs that he's not working on, because otherwise the Mishnah could have given a bigger chidush and say, if you're working on these figs, you cannot work on other figs. So what would be a situation, what would be a case of figs and figs that would be similar to figs and grapes, where you're working on one but not the other? If you say that when you're eating from this vine, then you cannot eat from a different vine, then how could you ever have a case of vines and vines that's similar to vines and figs, or figs and figs that's similar to vines and figs that are two separate species? How would you ever have a case where it would be permitted to eat of the same species if you say that when you're working on one, you cannot work on the other? So Amar Rav Shisha b'red Rav Idi b'mudlet Rav Shisha. So the Rav Idi says, I have an answer. Talking about when it's hanging, when they're hanging over each other. In other words, there's a distinction between. Let's say you have two vines that are hanging one on top of each other, and you're picking only from one vine. Well, then you have to be so careful. You can eat from both of them because they're all right there in the same place. But what you're not allowed to do is pluck from this vine and go eat from a different vine that's in a different area. That would be the case that's not allowed, because that would be similar to vines and dates on two different areas. That's not allowed. And so too, vines in different areas is not allowed. But if it was figs and figs, or vines and vines, one on top of each other, even though one is only picking from one, you could eat from the other. And so so it could be, in fact, that only that case would be permitted, but if it was a vine here and a vine there, then that would be prohibited. Alright, so that's not a proof. Let's try another one. Tashema. Ava moneh et asma'at shemagia lemekom hayafot ve'ochel. V'yamart oseh begefen zeh, ochel begefen acher, nezeh v'netev nechul. The Mishnah said that a worker can not eat from the bad figs over here and wait till he gets down the row where there are good figs. Now, if you say that a farmer, the worker can eat from any vine, even though he's only working on this vine, he can eat from a different vine, then why does he have to wait until he gets down there, until he gets to the good vines? Why doesn't he, even though he's over here, he should just be able to walk down to the other side where there's the good grapes, get some of those, bring them back to where he's working and eat them while he is working. So you see, this is a good proof that one is not allowed to eat from one vine when you're working on a different vine. You have to wait till you get to that vine and are working on that, the good one. Then only then you can eat from that. Is that a good proof? Hatam mishum bitul malacha laka mibayalan ki mibayalan hechadika ishto ubanav mai. No, that in that case, the reason why it's prohibited is because he is stopping from working, and he's stealing from the boss by taking time to go walk all the way down to the good ones and bring them back. That's why it's not allowed. But we're not asking that. We're asking a question on, let's say the worker's wife or his kids are with him, and the worker can tell his wife, listen, go down over there, I'm working on grapes over here. Go down to that vine and get some good grapes and bring them here. In that case, where he's not wasting any time from his boss, would that be allowed? And so we still don't have an answer. So let's try again. Tashema. V'chulam lo ameru el b'shat melacha. Ava mipnei hashem abeda leba'alim ameru po'alim ochlim b'halichatan me'uman le'uman v'chaziratan min hagat. So let's try to analyze this part of the Mishnah, that from a deoraita law, they said that worker's only allowed to eat while he's actually doing work, not while he's walking from one place to another. But because of the law of we should return something to its property owner, and actually is beneficial to the owner to allow the workers to eat while they're walking, so then therefore the rabbis modified the law, and they said that the workers are allowed to eat when they're walking from row to row or walking back from the wine press. Now, how do we understand this? The reason why mideoraita it was prohibited in the first place. Why would you say it's not allowed? Sabruha mehalech ke'oseh ma'aseh dameh. So right now, let's assume that walking is part of working. See, if you say, we're about to say in a minute, that walking is not working. Walking from one place to the other is not considered part of your activity. Well, then that would make sense. That would be one way to explain why they cannot eat on the doraita level. They cannot eat while they're walking because they're not working. But let's assume for a minute that walking is in fact like walking. So that's the reason why. So that really they would be allowed. Umishum hashem abedala babim hu de'achil midoraita la'achil al ma'oseh begefen ze eno ochel begefen acher. And yet we still say that it's only midrabanan because we want to return something to its owner. That's why we allow them to eat. But really midoraita they're not allowed to eat. Well, why would they not be allowed to eat while they're walking? We just said that walking is working. It must be that if you're working on this vine, you cannot eat from a different vine. And therefore, once you finished one row and now you're walking to a different place, you cannot eat from anything, from the thing that you just finished working on, because that you finished working on that vine, so you can no longer eat from that, and you didn't start with the next one, so you really wouldn't be able to eat from anything while you're walking. And so this would be a proof, if we assume that walking itself is part of labor, that's okay, but still midoraita you're not allowed to work, not allowed to eat, so that must be a proof that you're only allowed to eat from the very vine that you are doing labor on. So is that a good proof? No, it could be that when you're working on one vine, you are allowed to eat from a different vine. And the reason why midoraita here you're not allowed to eat while walking is because walking is not working. And that's why the rabbis come and say, oh, even so you're allowed. Okay, another version of this that's just flipped around. Let's assume, starting off, that walking is not considered labor. And that's why, from a doraita level, why the worker cannot eat while he's walking from row to row, because he's not doing work. If he's not actually doing work, he can't eat anything at all. But if he was doing work, then he would, on a doraita level, be permitted to eat. Alma ose begefen ze ochel begefen acher. In other words, if he was doing work, he would be able to eat even when he's transferring from one section to another, from one vine to another. So we see from here a proof that one is permitted to eat from any grapes, even from one vine he's not working on, even while he's working on a different vine. So is that a good proof? And we say no. Lo le'olam emalach oseh begefen ze no ochel begefen acher malech keoseh ma'aseh dameh. No, because it could be the other way around also, that when you're working on one, you cannot work on the other. That's why it's not allowed on a doraita level, even though walking is considered like labor, and therefore, since you can explain it this way and that way, there's no proof for either in either direction. Lastly, an animal, donkey, can eat while it's unloaded. And so we ask, wait, when it's being unloaded, from where can it eat? In other words, while it's on its back, it can't get to it. And then if you just unload it, let's say you just drop it's carrying bundles of something, and you drop it all at once, now it's not working anymore because it's not carrying it. So what do you mean when it's unloaded? So ema al chete poreket. No, just add a word here. It can eat until it's finished unloading. So we're assuming that it's carrying things, and then you're unloading piece by piece, and so it's carrying some grain, and you unload some of it, so it can eat from the grain while it's being unloaded. Tanena leha de tanura banan hamor vegamal ochlim mimasoy shal gabehen v'vad shelo yitol beyado v'ya'achilem. And we have what we just derived in the Mishnah is explicit in a baraita that a donkey and a camel can eat from the what's loaded onto their backs, as long as the one working with the animal does not take it and feed it with its hand. If you're feeding the animal by hand, then it's going to eat a lot more than it would just eat by itself if it's on the floor. So we see from here that it is permitted to take some things off the back of the animal, put it just in front of the animal, and it will eat on its own. You see, that is permitted because it is still carrying some of the burden, so it's still working with the same item that it's eating from, and that would be a case where it would be permitted. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.